Hey guys, Christian. This is going to be a review of Denis Villeneuve's Dune movies. They're some of my favorite movies of all time. And with the recent announcement that Dune Part 3 is going to be greenlit, I thought this would be the perfect time to talk about these movies. Just to preface this will be a spoiler review of both movies. So I'll be going into detailed plot points of both Dune and Dune Part 2, as well as the book. So if you haven't read the book, go ahead and pause this video, go read the book and come back, or just read the Wikipedia page. You should be totally fine. So without further ado, let's jump in. So first off, we have Dune, or I guess technically Dune Part 1. I think it's really interesting that Denis Villeneuve wanted to adapt the first Dune movie into two movies instead of just one movie. Because I know we got the David Lynch movie back in 1984, and I know originally David Lynch wanted to have like a 3-hour cut of that movie, but the studio was like, no, you got to cram it into 2 hours. So we kind of got the movie that we got. I think it's like a good attempt at the book, but obviously they cut out a lot of like characters and storylines, and they had to edit things together and like piece together with like voiceover. So it wasn't really the best attempt. So I'm glad that Denny respected the book enough to want to do it in two movies, just because there's just so much story to tell. It's such a dense world, it's such a dense universe that Frank Herbert wrote about. So it's kind of impossible to do everything in one movie. But I think the funny thing is that he and the studio kind of agreed that they would just adapt the first half of the Dune book and then see how that went. And then if it was successful, that they would go on to adapt the rest of the story, the second half of the book. So I thought that was really interesting for sure. But yeah, thank goodness the first movie did so well. And the fact that he didn't want to have burnout. He didn't want to experience what Peter Jackson did on Lord of the Rings movies by filming all three movies back to back to back and having these two Dune movies back to back, just because he really loves production values and he really loves having these extraordinary sets and going out on location just to get more immersed into the Dune world. So I think it was a good choice just to do the first movie, and then if it does well, then do a second one. But yeah, thank goodness the first movie did so well. It made over $400 million at the box office, despite all the COVID restrictions and the fact that it was simultaneously streamed on HBO Max and put in theaters. And yeah, now we got Dune Part 2, which we'll get to in a second. But yeah, just to jump into the movie itself, we're kind of introduced to the world of Dune, or Arrakis. And basically Arrakis is a desert planet, with harsh weather conditions. They have sandworms and desert storms and hot temperatures everywhere. But on the flip side, there's this substance called spice, or melange, or geriatric spice, depending on what you want to call it, which is basically the most precious resource in the universe, or the Duneverse, where basically if you ingest it, you have these kind of like supernatural abilities. You're able to see different futures, different paths like time could take. So they have these things called spice guild navigators, or basically kind of like these aquatic humanoid people who ingest the spice, and they're able to figure out like what the different paths are in the universe. Instead of like with Star Wars, you kind of plant it in the computer navigational system, and the ship is able to kind of like navigate past all these different dangers to the path that you want. But with Dune universe, there's no computers, there's no like artificial intelligence, because 10,000 years in the past of the Dune universe, there's this thing called the Butlerian Jihad, which is basically kind of like a machine uprising, kind of like the Terminator movies, where humans and the machines battled each other and the humans prevailed. And basically as a result of that, they wanted to have no artificial intelligence in this universe. So basically people had to become human computers. So we have the Spice Girl navigators, we have these people called mentats, which are human computers. They kind of serve the different houses within the universe. Every kind of duke or baron has a mentat, basically someone who can solve these complex equations for them without the use of a computer. We also have this sisterhood called the Bene Gesserit, who also take the spice as well. And they're kind of like this religious group of women who are able to, see different futures. So basically the spice runs this universe. It kind of helps out with the economy with this company called Chom, which is like a spice mining company. And one of the heads of those is the Harkonnen family, led by the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, played by Stellan Skarsgård, and his nephew, Lassu Rabban, played by Dave Bautista. And basically they're kind of like put in charge by the Emperor Shaddam IV to become kind of like the spice miners of Arrakis. So the story starts off with them using these harvesters, these giant machines on the planet of Arrakis to harvest all the spice. But on the flip side, we have these people called the Fremen. And the Fremen are basically people who are kind of like natives to Arrakis. They've kind of adapted to the harsh environment. They're kind of like in tune with nature, in tune with the giant sandworms and the tiniest like kangaroo mice. And at least in the opening of the story, we're kind of introduced to the character of Chani, played by Zendaya, who's introducing the audience to the whole conflict that's going on Arrakis, where the Harkonnen family is impeding on their land, impeding on the world of Dune for the spice, and the Fremen are kind of in conflict with Harkonnen. So there's all these different battles and different conflicts that are going on the planet of Arrakis. So the Emperor pretty much orders the Harkonnens to pull out of Arrakis, and we kind of find out that's kind of part of a whole conspiracy. So obviously Rabban and Vladimir are very upset about all this, but they know that there's something kind of deeper going on, which kind of gets revealed later on. So then we get introduced to the character of Paul Atreides, and Paul Atreides is the son of Duke Leto Atreides and Lady Jessica. And Leto is basically basically the Duke of a planet called Caladan, is this water planet where it constantly rains. There's all this moisture everywhere. And then he has a concubine named Jessica, who is actually a part of the Bene Gesserit religious group. And Paul is kind of like a chosen one in a way, because the whole backstory with the whole Bene Gesserit kind of crossbreeding program is that they're trying to find this being called the Kwisatz Haderach. And it's basically a person who can kind of see past, present, and future and kind of lead the Dune universe into a new future. So they're basically trying to find this leader. And their original plan was to have Lady Jessica bear a daughter, and that this daughter would marry this character named Feyd-Rautha Harkonnen, who gets introduced in part 2, which we'll get to in a second. And that heir would be the Kwisatz Haderach. But because Lady Jessica loved Duke Leto Atreides so much, and Duke Leto Atreides wanted to have a boy, she decided to manipulate, because the Bene Gesserit have the power to manipulate their offspring. So she basically manipulates her offspring to become a boy instead. So now Paul becomes the potential Kwisatz Haderach and basically becomes his chosen one. But that kind of ruins the whole Bene Gesserit plan of crossbreeding these different houses to make the perfect heir. So the Bene Gesserit are pretty much like testing Paul. Paul pretty much has this thing called the Voice, which is basically a way to kind of vocally manipulate people, kind of like the Jedi mind trick in Star Wars, where you can order something to do and they'll do it. Basically, you kind of manipulate your voice, your tone, and they'll be able to do it. So we kind of have that opening scene of Paul and Jessica at the dining room table, and Jessica's testing Paul in order to get him to order her with the voice to pass like a glass of water. And he does it, but it's not quite there just yet. So it's kind of like his training and everything like that. So we're kind of introduced the Atreides family. We're introduced to a couple other characters. There's Thufir Hawat, who's basically the mentat for Duke Leto Atreides, and he's basically training Paul in order to kind of use his sight to see different futures. We are introduced to the character of Gertie Halleck, who's basically kind of like Paul's trainer when it comes to like, swordsmanship. So we kind of have a cool scene of them trained together, where in kind of like close combat, because in this world they don't use guns. They have these things called laser guns, but they're kind of more like cannons and things like that. But there's no handguns, so everything's close combat. Everything's either like sword play or knife fights. So we have the training scene of Gurney Halleck training Paul Atreides. We introduced the concept of the shields, where if you tap on the shield lightly, it'll protect you, but if you kind of slowly penetrate it, it'll kind of go through the shield and stab you, and that kind of gets set up for later on. And then we're also introduced to the character of Duncan Idaho, played by Jason Momoa, kind of like the Han Solo of the Dune universe, who is kind of like one of the soldiers for the Atreides family and has like a really close relationship with Paul. We're introduced to the Herald of the Emperor, comes to Caladan, tells the Atreides family that they've now inherited the planet of Arrakis and that they'll be taking up the spice mining there. And they're kind of suspicious about what's going on. It's like it was always in the hand of the Harkonnens. We're kind of enemies with them. And Duke Leto Atreides is actually a cousin of the Baron as well. So there's also all this tension there. So it was like, what's going on? But, we'll definitely take up the challenge and we'll kind of go to Arrakis and we'll figure out like what's going on there. So they accept the call and they kind of make that transition to the planet of Arrakis. Before we get to that, we get introduced to the character of Gaius Helen Mohiam, who's basically the Reverend Mother of the Bene Gesserit. And she comes to test Paul to make sure that he's actually the Kwisatz Haderach. So we get the cool scene of the Gom Jabbar test, where Paul has to put his hand inside the box that Reverend Mother has on her lap. And basically she pulls out a Gom Jabbar, kind of like this poison needle, puts it at his neck, and basically tests him, because once he puts his hand in the box, he has a simulation of pain on his hand. But if he pulls his hand out of the box, then she'll stab him with the Gom Jabbar needle, and then, he'll die. So he's basically trying to test his ability to endure pain, because she has this theory of like an animal will chew off its leg in order to free itself from the trap. So she's trying to prove like, is he really a human? Can he endure pain? Can he pass this test? So eventually he does. And Reverend Mother still has her doubts that he could become the Kwisatz Haderach, but now, her eyes have been opened up more of a possibility that he could be the one. So now we have this conspiracy, that this kind of part that Paul and Jessica are playing once they actually go to Arrakis and then team up with the Fremen, because thousands of years ago, the Bene Gesserit basically planted this idea onto the Fremen, saying that there's just going to be this thing called the Lisa Agaib, which is basically like the chosen one, someone who will kind of lead them to paradise, someone who will start kind of like this holy jihad to take back the planet of Arrakis and basically bring it back to its original state, where, there's water back on the planet and can be like a healthy ecosystem. There'll be like oceans and peace and everything like that. So that's basically what they're trying to do, manipulate the Fremen in order to start this holy war, start this holy jihad. And this is kind of be the Bene Gesserit's way of regaining power in the universe, because in the Dune universe, women don't have power. They're kind of second-class citizens and they'll never be able to sit on the throne. It's usually a man. And by them having this genetic manipulation breeding program, they'll be able to find their way onto the throne, or at least have the Kwisatz Haderach, which will be a male figure, on the throne, and that he'll be able to give them the power that they need to kind of take over the universe. So it's basically like they're playing the long game in this. But yeah, we'll we'll see what happens once they actually get to Arrakis. So then we get into that kind of whole conspiracy when the Atreides family makes it to the planet of Arrakis and come to the stronghold of Arakim, which is basically where the Harkonnens were stationed when they were kind of taking over the planet. But as they're kind of like exploring Arakim, they see that there's different like booby traps, there's different, assassins that are after them. There's this thing called a hunter seeker, this mosquito-looking machine that's kind of go after Paul in certain scenes. We're introduced to a couple other characters. There's Leah Kynes, which is actually played by a woman, played by Duncan-Brewster, because in the book he's a male character, but Denis Villeneuve wanted to have the Fremen characters be played by black or brown people, which is a really good choice, just because the fact that they're kind of like desert dwellers and they're kind of natives. So he kind of wanted to have the Fremen kind of be represented that way, because like in the David Lynch movie, they're all kind of like white people, and it's like how are they like desert dwellers and everything like that? Because one of the inspirations for Frank Herbert was the movie Lawrence of Arabia, and so kind of the whole like white savior complex where T.E. Lawrence is in the Arabian desert protecting the Arabian people from all these different people who are trying to take over their lands. And Leah Kynes is basically the planetologist for Arrakis and kind of like a representative of the Fremen people. And basically she puts on the still suits for Paul and the Duke and Gurney. And still suits are basically kind of these suits that are able to kind of recycle people's water. So if you like sweat or if you pee or things like that, the motion from the still suit could like recycle your water so that, you can be able to drink it later on and survive in the harsh desert environment. And there's also the cool scene where they're kind of flying over the desert and they're seeing the harvesters, harvesting up the spice, and they see a sandworm coming in the distance and they're trying to rescue them. There's a carryall that comes in, tries to swoop in, lift it up, but then one of the attachments breaks off. So then Gurney, Duke, and Paul have to go in and try to rescue them. But then Paul's exposed to the spice after he takes off his mask. He's kind of seeing different visions of like possible futures and based on, his destiny of becoming like the leader of the Fremen, like the consequences that it could bring. But they're able to rescue the people. The giant sandworm comes in and consumes the harvester and kind of brings it down. So kind of get that really cool scene. We also get introduced to the character of Dr. Yue, was basically manipulated by the Baron to betray the Atreides family. He's kind of like the family doctor for the Atreides family. And basically the Baron kidnapped his wife and is kind of holding her hostage and orders Dr. Yue to find a way to betray the Atreides family, take them down. And in exchange, he'll give him back his wife. So in the middle of the night, Dr. Yue lowers the shields of the stronghold of Arakim. The Harkonnen troops swoop in and they're blasting everything, destroying all their ships. We get Gurney Halleck going out there in the battle, trying to defend Arakim, kind of gets lost in the battle. And then on the inside, Duke Leto is kind of trying to investigate like what's going on. He finds the character of Mapes, who's kind of like the ambassador of the Fremen, lying dead on the ground, and she's been stabbed. He tries to go help her, but then Dr. Yue kind of blows a dart at the Duke. He tries to put up his shields, but it's too late. So then he gets stabbed by it. He's kind of like laying down all limp. Dr. Yue goes up to him and then brings up this fake tooth to him with a poisonous gas and kind of implants it into the Duke's mouth. And he says if he bites down on it, then he'll release a poisonous gas. And then if he's close to the Baron will eventually die. And then he says, if you do this for me, I'll make sure that Paul and Jessica are still alive, because the Harkonnens plan to kidnap Paul and Jessica and leave them left for dead in the desert. So the Duke is taken by the Baron and it's kind of like in that dining area, all naked, still limp. The Baron gets close up to him. The Duke bites down on the fake tooth and the poisonous gas is released. The gas spreads throughout the room and the Baron's mentat named Pitter dies, and along with the other Harkonnens in there. But since the Baron is so fat and overweight, he has this dispenser technology that kind of like lifts him up to the top of the room, so he's kind of safe from the gas, but he's still affected by it in a way, but he survives. And then on the flip side, Paul and Jessica are taken by a couple of Harkonnen troops and an ornithopter, which is like this kind of like mechanical dragonfly looking machine. They're trying to escape. They're using the voice on the troops. At first, Paul tries to use a voice that's like, release my mother's bonds, but it doesn't quite work. So he has to kind of concentrate and use it again. A little bit of did I mind trick kind of thing going on. And then he uses the voice. They're able to kill off the Harkonnen soldiers, and they find that from kit that was left for them by Dr. Yue, because it has a little black diamond, because there's a little black diamond on Dr. Yue's forehead. And that really much indicates to any of the royal houses that he won't betray them. But oh well, but he still tries to save Paul and Jessica's life. As the Frem kit has the tent, has the ducal ring from Duke Leto Atreides. So then they unfortunately find out that the Duke has been killed. They're in the desert, but they have the Frem tent, so they're able to survive the night. And then we cut back to Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, who's kind of like in that oil bath kind of thing. And he kind of gives the order to Raban that he could restart the spice mining again. So him and the Harkonnen forces, as well as the Sardaukar, and the Sardaukar are basically the elite soldiers for the Emperor. So then they all go back to Arrakis. Arrakis, and they're basically taking over. And then we cut back to Jessica and Paul back in the desert. They finally meet up with Liet Kynes and Duncan Idaho. And Duncan Idaho was sent beforehand to the planet of Arrakis to kind of meet with the Fremen and kind of make peace with them. So then they all meet at the planetologist base that Kynes runs, and they basically kind of use it to regroup. They figure out that they have kind of an ornithopter at the ready for them to escape, but then the Sardaukar and the Harkonnen soldiers invade the base, and Duncan Idaho basically sacrifices himself in order to get Paul, Kynes, and Jessica out of there. We have that cool scene where he has like the sword and he's like slashing all the Sardaukar forces and wiping them all out, but then eventually the Sardaukar become too much for him and then he dies. At least that's what we think. And then we cut to Kynes, who's kind of watching Jessica and Paul kind of fly off in the distance in their ornithopter, but then unfortunately she gets killed by the Sardaukar and she pounds on the ground to summon a sandworm, and the sandworm comes up from the ground and consumes all of them. But then Paul and Jessica get away. They kind of get caught in that desert storm, and Paul kind of uses the force. No, he turns off all the controls and decides to kind of go with the flow of the storm just because he wants to be like at one with the planet of Arrakis. So the storm kind of blows them away. And then basically once they figure out like they're coming out of the storm, they regain the controls, they land, they kind of outrun a giant sandworm, which is a really cool scene. They are reunited with the character of Stilgar, played by Javier Bardem, and he was introduced earlier on in the story where he was kind of brought into Arakim and kind of negotiate a peace treaty with Duke Leto Atreides, and Duncan Idaho's there and Gurney's there as well. And we kind of had that funny scene where he's like, spitting, and in the Fremen culture, it's like a sign of respect. And then, Duncan does the same thing. I thought that was really funny. But yeah, they kind of have this whole concept of like not wasting water because, they want to preserve it and eventually use that water to bring life back to Arrakis. So I think that's a really, really cool concept. And then when we're reintroduced to the character of Chani, and then we're also introduced to the character of Jamis, and he's kind of very wary of Lady Jessica and Paul. He doesn't really believe that they're like the chosen ones. So he challenges Paul to a crysknife fight. So they have their fight, and then Paul eventually kills Jamis. He doesn't really want to kill anyone. He feels very hesitant of it, but he has to do it because in their culture, if you kill someone, you pretty much inherit everything that they own. Because in the book, he actually kills Jamis and then he inherits his wife and 2 kids. But in the movie, they cut that out, which, I thought was a really good choice. We don't really need Paul with more wives, as we'll get later on in the story, because it was actually introduced while Paul and Jessica were in the desert that they had this whole plan of if Paul ever confronts the Emperor, his gain to the throne is basically, marrying his daughter, Princess Irulan, who gets introduced in part 2. And in the book, every chapter kind of starts off with an epigraph of excerpts from these different books by this character named Mo Adib, who we'll find out more about in part 2. And then everything is kind of ended with Princess Irulan, with her writing all these different excerpts. And so that's kind of like their plan to get into the throne. But we'll definitely get more of that in part 2. And the movie kind of ends with Paul and Jessica being accepted by the Fremen. Jessica agrees to help Stilgar and the rest of the Fremen learn about the Weirding Way because Stilgar tries to challenge Jessica. She disarms him because she's, a Bene Gesserit, and they're kind of like able to kind of predict different moves. So Stilgar wants to know more about that. So then he accepts Jessica and Paul into their culture, and they walk further into the desert to get to their siege, their main hideout. And then Chani turns to Paul and says, "This is only the beginning," and we'll see how that goes for those characters. But yeah, that's the end of part 1. And then that leads us into Dune part 2. And then right off the bat, we're introduced to the character of Princess Irulan, played by Florence Pugh. And I think this is a really good choice to introduce a lot of the new characters early on, especially Princess Irulan and Emperor Shaddam IV, played by Christopher Walken, because in the book, they're not introduced until like the last 40, 50 pages of the book. So I'm glad that they kind of introduce those characters more because they'll definitely be bigger roles in this movie. And then in, the second book, Dune Messiah, especially, we kind of have that opening scene kind of recapping the events of part 1 and then kind of setting us up for the events of part 2. And then Princess Irulan kind of has the suspicions that Paul might still be alive. And that's kind of like a subplot that goes throughout part 2. Again, different from the book. We don't really get anything from Princess Irulan or the Emperor or the Reverend Mother Gaius. So I'm glad they kind of cut back to those characters throughout to kind of build those characters up a little bit more, kind of showing the suspicions, kind of like their reactions to what's going on Arrakis and what's going on with the Fremen with all their uprisings and things like that. And then we kind of get into this really cool opening sequence, which wasn't in the book, but I think it's really cool, of Paul and Jessica, Chani Stilgar, and all the Fremen kind of hiding out from the Harkonnen forces. They're kind of in their black suits and they're kind of like patrolling the planet. The ship is kind of floating up and they're kind of like floating down. It's a really cool shot. We also get that really cool shot of them using Spencer technology to kind of like float up the sides of the canyon because they don't want to be on the sand, because in the world of Dune, if you stomping on the ground, it could summon a sandworm and you can obviously, get eaten and killed by one. So like the Fremen have kind of adapted where they kind of like take steps, but they kind of like manipulate their pace so that there's not like a consistent thumping so they can, survive survive traveling in the desert. So I think that was a really cool choice. But yeah, eventually Paul and the Fremen and Jessica, confront the Harkonnen troops. They kill them all off. Then they take their water, which is really funny. Some of them are still alive, but Chani and Stilgar are using like their devices to suck out their water, and some of them are still alive. They're still like, ugh. So I thought that was really fun. But yeah, they eventually arrive in the siege, and Paul and Jessica are definitely not welcomed by the Fremen people, at least within that siege. They see that Jamis has been killed. He's kind of wrapped up in burlap sack kind of looking thing, and they're all like really reactionary, like Jamis, like why'd you kill Jamis? So I thought that was a really cool change from the books. In the book, they're pretty much accepted into the culture, and things are all good. Another thing that they changed from the book that was pretty significant is the fact that there's kind of like division between the Fremen culture. There's people who kind of like more like the younger crowd, like Chani, and the character of Shishakli, who's a completely made up character. She was in the books, but I'm glad they added her to the movie, where they're kind of like not really believing that Paul is the chosen one, and they really believe like this was all just kind of fabricated by the Bene Gesserit, and they really should bring it on themselves to kind of lead themselves to paradise, and they shouldn't have kind of like this outside forces or this kind of prophecy to enslave them. A line that Chani says later on in the movie, he's like, this prophecy enslaves us. So I thought that was a really cool choice, because again, in the book, Chani kind of goes with the flow of the Fremen culture. She really believes that Paul is the one, but I'm glad they made this change, kind of made her more independent, and then we'll see what happens to her later on at the end of the movie. But for now, the younger crowd doesn't really believe in. The older crowd is kind of like the old fundamentalists who believe in this prophecy, especially with the character of Stilgar. And I really like the fact that he's kind of like goes on like blind faith, where Paul's like, I'm not the Lisan Gaib, I'm not the chosen one, like stop believing me and stop believing this prophecy. But then Stilgar's like, oh my gosh, he's so humble. Of course the Lisan Gaib wouldn't believe that he was the one. We have to follow him now. So I'm glad they had that change within the book of having this kind of division between the two different groups. So we get to the scene where Stilgar is trying to convince Lady Jessica to be the Reverend Mother, and we get the scene where she's kind of reluctant at first, and then both she and Paul are trying to convince the Fremen like, we're not who you think we are. And then Stilgar's like, well, if you're not who you say you are, then you have no need for us, and then we'll steal your water. And then Jessica's like, okay, yeah, we'll go with the plan. So then she takes the water of life, and then we find out later what the water of life actually is, and she transmutes it. And then as a result of that, she's able to take on all the memories and all the emotions of all the past Reverend Mothers. And what gets brought up actually in the last film is that Lady Jessica's actually pregnant with their daughter, and the nature of the water of life, it kind of awakens the fetus within her, who turns out to be Aaliyah. And Aaliyah is a character that appears in the book. I guess that's like another thing that they change in this movie, is that the timeline is actually more compressed in the movie than the book, because in the book there's actually a 2-year time jump, and they cut to 2 years later, and Aaliyah is actually born. She's a 2-year-old, but she has the mind of a full-grown woman. And they kind of have a hint of that in a flash forward scene that Paul has a vision of the future, and we see Anya Taylor-Joy actually plays Aaliyah. So that's kind of like the little tip of the hat to that storyline. But in the book, she's actually a 2-year-old with the mind of a fully grown woman. But then Denis Villeneuve and the writers thought it'd just be kind of awkward because of the fact that later on in the book, spoiler alert, she ends up killing the Baron, and it just would have been upsetting to see a child kill like an adult man. So they decided to cut that out and have the timeline just take place over 6 to 9 months rather than have that 2-year time jump, which I thought was like a really good change for sure. Another change from the book is the fact that Chani and Paul actually have a son named Leto, who he names after his father, and he's about 1 year old when the final battle takes place, and spoiler, he ends up getting killed in that battle. So again, just been very upsetting to see a young child get killed in a story like this. So yeah, the writers decided to just cut that out entirely and just have it just center around like Paul and Chani and their whole relationship, getting to know each other, and then kind of moving forward from there. But anyway, back to the scene. So Lady Jessica is able to transmute the water of life, and she's able to survive, and then becomes a new Reverend Mother. And the Fremen are thinking like, oh my gosh, it's just a sign that, she's the chosen one's mother, and that, the prophecy is coming true. But then in reality, Paul kind of admits to the Fremen that it's like, no, she's not this person that you think she is. The Bene Gesserit are able to just transmute different like poisons. That's pretty much the reason why she survives. But the Fremen are like, no, Lisan Gaib, and all this stuff. So there's definitely kind of internal conflict within Paul about like, does he want to embrace this destiny of being the Lisan Gaib, or does he just want to fight with the Fremen and kind of align with them, kind of more in line with what his father was planning on doing when he originally came to Arrakis, create an alliance with the Fremen and help them retake it from the Harkonnens and restore peace back to Arrakis. So he's having that more of that internal struggle, whereas in the book he's kind of playing the game a little bit more. He kind of has some conflict, but he's really just trying to have the Fremen kind of buy into this story and have this whole revenge plot. But at least in the movie he's a little bit more conflicted, which actually a change that I like. So now we kind of have Jessica and Paul kind of at odds with each other. Jessica's really trying to convince the Fremen to kind of buy into the fact that Paul is Lisan Gaib and she's kind of like the Reverend Mother according to this prophecy. And she has kind of like the creepy scene of her kind of like walking down the halls of the Steech Tabor and communicating with Aaliyah because they have the psychic connection, and she she's pregnant. She's like, we must convince the naive to believe in us. So definitely like a really creepy choice for sure. So you kind of think like, wait, is Lady Jessica kind of like the villain of the story? It's kind of like very, very ambiguous. Is she just giving into the story? Is she just following orders? Is she actually evil? It's kind of like the unknown that Denis Villeneuve is kind of playing with that. So I thought that was definitely an interesting choice for sure. Then we kind of get to the montage of scenes. We get the scenes with Paul being tested by the Fremen, going out into the desert and, trying to survive the night, to survive like all the different creatures that appear in the night and like the different superstitions that the Fremen have. Then we get more scenes with Chani and Paul, which is really cool, getting more of that love story. We do get a little bit of that in the book, but I'm glad they kind of develop it a little bit more here in the movie. We kind of have like the little montage of scenes, like all the different tests that Paul has to do in order to become more incorporated into the Fremen culture. He has those raids on the Harkonnen harvesters, which is a really cool action scene that actually not in the book, but it's kind of like mentioned, but I'm glad they actually had a whole scene kind of devoted to that, kind of like guerrilla warfare, because like another inspiration for Frank Herbert was the Vietnam War, because he wrote this back in the 1960s, and it was kind of in the shadow of the Vietnam War. So they have like these all-powerful, American force coming into the jungles of Vietnam, and then the Viet Cong fighters being able to take them down with just like their willpower and like all these booby traps that they had. It's kind of like a reflection on that. And then, like I was saying before, Lawrence Arabia was another huge inspiration for sure, because that movie was coming out like as he was writing the book. So that's like another inspiration that he took for, having, they're called the Fedaykin fighters, and Shawnee's kind of a part of that. And they kind of band together to do all these raids on these different harvesters. It was cool seeing the scene where they're kind of like under the sand and they have these little tubes to breathe. And then you see this giant harvester kind of coming towards them, and you're like, what's going on? And then you finally see them like pop out of the sand. They take it down, and Paul proves himself. And then, he gets the name of Usul, which is the Fremen word for base of the pillar. And then he also gets the name Muad'Dib, which is the name of the little kangaroo mouse. And he tries to have like a humble name for himself. And, that's another sign that Stilgar thinks that he's Lisan a.k.a. because he's so humble, because the moisture from the dew kind of collects in their ears and they're able to kind of collect their own water, and they're very resourceful. So that's why Paul gives himself that name. So now he's known as Paul Muad'Dib for the rest of the movie. And then the name Muad'Dib kind of becomes the name that people are fearing across the universe. Like, who's this Muad'Dib? We need to kill him. And then we kind of get into the epic scene, like the final test that Paul needs in order to prove himself as a Fremen is the riding with the sandworm scene. And oh my gosh, this scene was probably my favorite scene in the entire movie. And I know this is a scene that Denis Villeneuve was conceiving in his mind for years and years and years, ever since he read the book, and he was like doing little storyboards when he was a teenager. And the book is a little bit vague. Actually, it's funny enough, they kind of start off the scene and they kind of cut to what's going on with Jessica and Leah, and they cut back to Paul ride the sandworm and everything like that. Actually, in the book, it's kind of more similar to the David Lynch version, but obviously not as comical. But I'm glad in the Denis Villeneuve version, he kind of made it more like a test for Paul to prove himself as one of the Fremen, whereas opposed in the book, he's already part of the Fremen culture. It's like this is 2 years later, and this is kind of like his final test in order to be fully accepted. So I'm glad this is kind of like one of his first tests to prove that he's a Fremen. But yeah, it's like super epic. We're watching them in theater, and like the sound design and like the visual effects, and like your seats are like rumbling like as he's like running across the sand dune and jumping onto the worm, and like he's like trying to hold still, and then finally he kind of steps up and like slowly but surely starts to ride the sandworm. And then the epic Hans Zimmer music, I listened to that soundtrack like over and over again. One of my favorite songs from the soundtrack, which is really cool. But yeah, so finally Paul proves himself as one of the Fremen. He's finally on board, and then the legend of Muad'Dib kind of spreads throughout the universe. And then we kind of cut back to the villains, the Emperor Arulan, Reverend Mother Gaius, and then Baron Harkonnen and Raban. And Raban is trying to send out his forces onto the planet of Arrakis to like stop Muad'Dib and the Fremen, but Paul and the rest of the Fremen are too skilled for them. So then we kind of get the big gun, get introduced to the character of Bade Rotha, played by Austin Butler, one of the best characters in the whole movie. He's like really cool, and like what an entrance. The first scene that we get with him, he's getting like all prepared for his fight in the arena. He kills all these different concubines, and he's just super psychotic. And then we finally get to the arena scene, which is super amazing and epic. It's really cool that they shot the whole thing with infrared cameras. So like when they're indoors, it's kind of like normal color and everything, but then as soon as they go outdoors, everything becomes black and white and infrared. And the reason for that is because the planet they live on is called Gidi Prime, and has a black sun, so everyone's like pale and like has hair, no eyebrows and things like that. In the book, they're described as having like red hair, which the David Lynch version stays true to, but I'm glad that Denis kind of had this different choice just to have this kind of stark contrast between the Atreides and the Harkonnens. But yeah, we get the arena scene. We have the scene where Fade is going against like 3 different warriors, and 2 of them are drugged, so they get killed pretty easily, but the third one from the Atreides house isn't drugged, and Fade doesn't know that until like the last minute. And then the Baron and Lady Fenrig, played by Lea Seydoux, are like, wait, what's going to happen? Does he know the fact that the Atreides isn't drugged? Like, what's going to happen? And then Baron's like, oh, just wait and find out. And then, he has that eye contact with Fade. He's like, show them who you are. And then Fade, has that nod and fights the Atreides gladiator. Fade removes his shields just to know that this isn't going to be an easy fight for him. And he eventually, kills the Atreides warrior and then, proves himself as being the one to kind of take Raban's place as the person to find Muad'Dib and wipe him out and then take control again of the universe. So now we have these two powerful entities going against each other. And then obviously we still have the whole kind of Bene Gesserit plan with Lady Fenring trying to seduce Fade Rotha in order to produce an heir and then have that be the official Kwisatz Haderach and then kill off Paul and then have the Harkonnens, kind of retake the universe. So we kind of have like two different plots going on. So then we have the scene of Jessica wanting to go down south to convince the southern Fremen in order to get on board on Paul's side, take over the Harkonnens, and then slowly but surely start the jihad. And then Paul is feeling very conflicted. He and Chani have those scenes together. Paul wakes up from his dream, the fact that if he goes down south, billions of lives will be wiped out, which is a setup for what happens in Dune Messiah, but I'll get to that later. So he's obviously feeling very conflicted. Chani's trying to encourage him and say like, hey, you have to stay who you are. Don't give in to this whole prophecy. Just use us to wipe out the Harkonnens and then take back Arrakis and then, have peace here. Don't worry about the Holy War and all this stuff. So there's all this conflict. Paul keeps having visions of a woman walking in the middle of the desert with all these suffering people. And then the woman turns around. He figures out that it's actually his mother. So there's conflict between him and his mother there. And then he has a dream of atomics coming down. Atomics are these nuclear bombs that each of the houses is in possession of coming down, blasting in front of Chani and her face is all melted. So obviously he's having a lot of conflict of like when to go down south and, slowly but surely things kind of start to fall apart and he kind of has to make a decision in the end. And then we get to the scene of the reunion between Paul and Gurney Halleck. Gurney Halleck has survived the coup that happened on Arrakeen in the last movie and has now become a smuggler for spice. And we have that cool scene of him playing his instrument and coming up with songs and then kind of going on another smuggler run in a way with this harvester. But then it gets attacked by the Fremen and they're about to attack each other. But then Paul defends himself against Gurney. And, he's kind of masked up and can't really see his face. And then he says that line, I recognize your steps, old man. And then reveals himself to be Paul because that was a line that he said in the first movie when they were training. It's like, I recognize your steps, old man. And then, Gurney has a smile on his face, like, you young pup, you young pups. And they reunite. And then Gurney comes onto the side of Paul. He tells Paul about the atomics that the Atreides has and that they could use the atomics to wipe out the Harkonnens. So they travel to that secret hiding place and Sildar has that line. It's like, why would you have the base here? And then Gurney has that other line of like, oh, we hidden in plain sight because it'd be obvious. And then they kind of look at each other like, what are you talking about? So then Paul uses his fingerprints into that slot and then they're kind of have all this access to these atomics and then that'll become very important later on in the movie. So there's this whole tension of like, are we going to use these atomics? Like, is it going to be dangerous? How many people are going to be wiped out with all this stuff? So slowly but surely, we're kind of preparing for that final confrontation between the Fremen, the Harkonnens, and then the Sardaukar. So then finally, Fade Rotha comes to the siege and attacks it, wipes out all the Fremen who are there, and then that kind of pressures Paul and the rest of his Fedaykin warriors to finally go down south and convince the southern Fremen to come onto his side and then fight in this final battle, wipe out the Harkonnens, and then take back Arrakis. So then Paul goes down south, and then he's forced to drink the water of life, and then has all those visions of the different people in his past, and then it causes him to die because there's this whole theory that if a man drinks the water of life, it can kill them, but if a woman drinks it, then they'll be able to transmute and then survive. So there's this whole pressure of like, oh, is Paul going to die if he drinks this? So they kind of have this backup plan of Chani, because her real name is Sahaya, which gets brought up earlier in that scene, that beautiful scene between Paul and Chani on top of the sand dunes talking about themselves. It's Sahaya, which is another name for Desert Spring, and they realize that by her tears could resurrect Paul. So then she travels down south, sees that Paul's dead. She's kind of crying for him, which is another thing. It's like, don't waste your water. And like, if you cry for something that you actually really care about because you're giving up your water for them. So then she, wipes away their tear, puts it into the water of life, takes a drop of it, puts it on Paul's lips, and then he resurrects. So then people are like, oh my gosh, he is Elisa a.k.a. because he resurrected. So then all the Fremen are like amazed by it. Chani's a little taken aback by it. She's like, wait, is he Elisa a.k.a. or is he just, an idiot? So, slaps him, walks out of the siege. So now Paul is fully the Kwisatz Haderach. He's able to resurrect. He was able to transmute the water of life. He's able to see the different past, present, and future, see that fine line of where they're supposed to be going in their future. So he decides to go to the Fremen stronghold where all the leaders will come and gather and decide what they should be doing. And there's this whole conflict of Stilgar wants Paul to take his place. And the only way that he can take his place and speak during this whole meeting is for Paul to kill Stilgar, but Paul refuses. refuses and decides to just go anyway, which Sogar reluctantly accepts. So Paul finally arrives at the leadership council, and then we get this epic scene, that epic shot of him walking. He's kind of like this small figure in the frame, and it's kind of like mirage haziness. And then behind him are these huge sandworms, and he's walking in slow motion, and all these fundamentalists are just kind of watching him in awe. You get another great score by Hans Zimmer, like electric guitar kind of sound to it. He walks in like all BA and everything with his hood up. The Fremen are kind of like parting the Red Seas for him as he walks through. We kind of get that overhead shot of hundreds of Fremen on the tops of their heads. They're kind of like parting for Paul as he's walking in. And we get like the epic speech. He's trying to convince these fundamentalists that he is Lisan al-Gaib, and points out to different people in the group saying like, I know your past. I know who your mother is. I know like she was hit in the face with a rock and she was blinded. You know, he has that whole kind of epic line. It's like, I am Paul Mortier Atreides, Duke of Arrakis. And another kind of like acting choice and directorial choice by Denis Villeneuve for Timothée Chalamet. Timothée Chalamet is, you know, skinny, you know, kind of more like on the quieter side, you know, based on his like other filmography. But as soon as he becomes Lisan al-Gaib, or I guess technically the Kwisatz Haderach, then he kind of shoots him a little bit from below to make him look bigger. He kind of has like more clothing to make him look bigger. He kind of deepens his voice a little bit more. He has his hair all slicked back, so he looks a little bit more intimidating. So all the fundamentalists are kind of on board with Paul being the Lisan al-Gaib, and they kind of follow him into battle. And then we kind of get into the third act, the big epic showdown where the Emperor and his Sardaukar forces finally come down to the planet of Arrakis, and that kind of ship that looks like the Death Star a little bit, because it kind of gets revealed, you know, later on that the Emperor kind of knew about this whole attack, and the reason why he wants to kind of keep this whole thing quiet, of the fact that he had this whole conspiracy with the Harkonnens. He was working with the Harkonnens to have them wipe out the Atreides family, so he doesn't want that to get out. So he decides to go onto the planet himself. He brings Irulan, he brings all his Sardaukar forces, and then they're kind of like floating above their little stronghold, this kind of like silver stronghold. It kind of looks like knives, kind of like interlocking with each other, with the shield and everything, kind of protect them from the sandstorms, which will be very important for the final battle. Is that something that the Fremen are counting on, is that the sandstorm will conceal them as they're kind of moving their forces in. The Emperor and his stronghold is above this kind of like rock quarry that kind of protects them from the sandstorm. So then Paul orders the atomics to be fired out onto the quarry, so that explodes, so that the rock formation falls down, so that the storm will be able to run through, and the Fremen forces will be able to have a full attack on them. Kind of have another epic shot from behind Paul as he's looking out into the distance as the atomics are coming, and you see this giant mushroom cloud of explosions, and his cape is billowing in the wind. Then we get into the huge epic battle. We show the scene of the Sardaukar forces outside of the Emperor's stronghold, and, you know, they're ready for attack, and then the sandstorm's coming in. They're trying to hold their ground, and then suddenly we get another epic shot of the three sandworms coming out of the dust and like crashing down on them. The Fremen are riding them into battle, you know, with their flags and everything, the Atreides flags and the Fremen flags, you know, going into battle. And then it's just super epic. And I remember just watching that in the theater, just like, I cannot believe what I'm seeing right now. This is like what it must have been like to watch Lord of the Rings, because I was a little bit too young to watch Lord of the Rings in theaters. So I'm like, yeah, this must have been like to watch the original Star Wars movies in theaters, or like the original Lord of the Rings, like epic battle. And I was just in awe the entire time during this whole battle. The Fremen coming in, you know, popping out of the ground, taking on the Sardaukar forces. It's just like epic all around. And then we kind of cut to the inside, where there's kind of like the infighting going on between the Harkonnens and the Emperor. So the Sardaukar end up chopping off the Baron's life support, and he's like falling on the ground. The Emperor is upset with the Baron and with Raban for failing, for not being able to kill Muad'Dib. So they kind of like try to get rid of them. So we finally get to the climax of the fight, where Paul and his Fremen forces are able to storm the Emperor's stronghold. The Emperor, Irulan, and Lady Gaius are going to huddle up in the corner with their Sardaukar. The Sardaukar go out into the dust as it's billowing into the stronghold, and then only like Paul comes out, you know, covered in blood, with a couple of his Fremen forces. Another epic shot. He's walking up to the Baron, because like the Baron's kind of like on the side of the steps. You know, he sees the Emperor's throne up in the distance. He's kind of like trying to crawl up to it, and then, you know, Paul walks up to him. And then, because earlier on, Paul figured out that he's actually Harkonnen, because there's this whole thing of Lady Jessica is actually the daughter of the Baron, and the reason why, you know, Baron's so big and fat and everything is because a curse was put on him. Lady Gaius kind of manipulated him in order to produce an heir for her, and that heir turned out to be Lady Jessica. There's this whole thing with the Baron in the book that I don't really want to get into, just as far as, you know, his preferences and whatnot, but I'll just leave it at that. If you want to read it in the book, go ahead, or the Wikipedia page. But that's the reason why he's fat, and the reason why he has a daughter is because there's kind of like manipulation going on. So Paul and Jessica find out that they're Harkonnens, and that the only way to defeat a Harkonnen is to fight like a Harkonnen. Cut back to the scene of Paul confronting the Baron, and he says, "Hello, grandfather," and, you know, stabs him in the neck, kind of like a callback to the whole Gom Jabbar test, you know, showing that the Baron kind of like died like an animal in a way. So in the book, it's actually Aaliyah who kills the Baron. She has a little Gom Jabbar needle and like stabs him in the hand, and that's how he dies. But obviously, they cut Leah from the movie and have it Paul be the one who killed the Baron, which I think is like another good choice just because it makes it more personal. The Baron's one of the reasons why his father is killed, so it just makes more sense to have Paul be the one to take revenge on the Baron and kill him. So the Baron's dead. Paul orders his men to arrest the Emperor, Irulan, in his court, and then bring him into Arrakeen for the whole climax of the scene. And then we cut to a couple moments later where it's wrapping up the end of the battle, where Gurney and his forces are taking on the Sardaukar troops and the Harkonnen troops, and Gurney finally has his revenge on Raban for giving him that scar and then killing a lot of his family and friends from the Atreides family. So that whole conflict is wrapped up, and then we cut to the last scene of the movie where we get the final confrontation between Paul and the Emperor, and Paul challenges the Emperor for the seat of the throne, but obviously the Emperor refuses, and he decides to enlist Feyd-Rautha to fight for him. So we have the epic knife fight at the very end between Paul and Feyd, which is like really amazing, like super fast, quick and epic. I mean, obviously, there's that stunt double where Paul has that flippy scene, but other than that, it's like really, really cool. But eventually Paul kills Feyd, which is kind of unfortunate because I really liked Austin Butler in this role, so it's too bad that we won't get to see more of him. So yeah, he kills him. He tells the Emperor to kiss his ring. The Emperor like bows down, kisses the ring. We also asked him like why the Emperor had his father killed, and the Emperor explains that the Duke was a weak man who led by the heart instead of leading with powerful forces, so that's why he had him killed, because it was a sign of weakness. So that gets revealed, and then the whole plot twist, the scene where everybody was like, in the audience, was Paul asked for Irulan's hand in marriage, and Chani's obviously very much in shock. In the book, she kind of already knows the whole plan, and she's very, obviously heartbroken because she wanted to marry Paul, but then Chani becomes Paul's concubine in the book. But then the big change from the book to the movie was that Chani, is obviously very upset. She had no idea about this plan, and she, goes off and does her own thing. And then meanwhile, the other houses are descending on Arrakis, and Gurney tells Paul that they haven't accepted the fact of his ascendancy to being the Emperor. So then Paul makes a decision to start the Holy War, start the Jihad, and tells Stilgar, lead him to paradise. And then Stilgar takes his Fremen forces and goes into the ships and flies off to Arrakis to start the big Holy War. And then meanwhile, Chani's out in the desert. She activates the thumper, calls Shai-Hulud the sandworm, and then that's the end of the movie. So obviously a very different ending from the book, where now we really don't know what's going to happen. Chani's kind of off doing her own thing, and now this Holy War is being started by Paul. So if they're going to stick with what's going on in Dune Messiah, there's got to be some kind of reunion in that. So spoiler alert for Dune Messiah. With that one, it's 12 years later, and the Holy War has been going on. 61 billion people have been wiped out, and Paul is now the Emperor of the Imperium, and now there's all these different forces that are trying to band together to assassinate him. And in the book, Paul and Chani, they haven't been married, but Chani's his concubine, and later on they have twins. So it'd be interesting what they do with the movie. Obviously, there's going to be some kind of resolution or not if they decide to stick with the Dune Messiah book. And if they want to do more Dune books, obviously with the rest of the Dune series, the third Dune book is Children of Dune, which is obviously about the twins of Paul and Chani. So it'd be interesting how they kind of have that resolution. I think for Dune Part 3, it's going to be more of like a redemption story for Paul. I think certain things are going to happen to him, some stuff that happens in the book, but I think overall Paul's going to be redeemed, and then maybe he and Chani are going to work together to stop the Jihad and then stop these different forces who are trying to, assassinate Paul. So yeah, it'd be really interesting. I'm glad that Denis kind of going in a different direction with the movies, just to make it more for, modern day audience, kind of the Gen Z audience, where, the future's kind of in their hands, this world that the previous generations have kind of destroyed. This new generation's kind of rising up, making their own decisions and trying to make the world a better place. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see what happens with it. I know China's going to have a big part in it. She's going to be more of like, the independent warrior type, which would be really cool to see, as opposed in the book where she's kind of like submissive, kind of goes with the flow, things like that, kind of like barefoot and pregnant and whatnot. Whereas in the movie, she's more like the warrior, the fighter, the Fedaykin warrior, along with the fighters and everything. So I'm glad to see what they do with that. Hopefully it'll be fast tracked. Hopefully it's going to be Denis' next movie. I know he has another couple movies on his slate that he wants to produce. So I was hoping that we get it sooner rather than later. But I know these two Dune movies took a long time to make, a lot of time, a lot of energy. I think he said it took like 6 years to make both these movies. So obviously he wants to take a break from the Dune universe. So, but just from the success that part 2 has been having, made like almost $300 million more than the first Dune movie. So I'm sure the studio's like, hey, can we get that Dune part 3? We got to get that money. So we'll see what happens with Denis. I know he's very much a filmmaker where he wants to take his time to make sure that the product's right. And the fact that Dune Messiah takes place 12 years after the original Dune, he wanted Timothée Chalamet and Zendaya and a couple of the younger characters to age up a little bit more. So that makes sense. So maybe he'll do his other movie and then he'll do his Dune part 3 right after that, as the actors aged up a little bit. But yeah, overall, yeah, I'm really excited about Dune part 3. I love love the first two Dune movies, as you can clearly see by my gushing review. But yeah, thanks so much for watching this video. What's your favorite part of Dune? Who's your favorite character? Like, what's your favorite fight scene? Have you read the book? Have you watched both movies? Yeah, let me know in the comments below. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos, and I'll see you next time. Long live the fighters!